Hello and welcome to the University of Louisiana at Lafayette's College of Liberal Arts Showcase. I'm your host, Jordan Kelman, Dean of the College. Every episode, we'll bring you one of our fascinating faculty, researchers, and teachers to talk about how they are making a difference in the Acadiana community and the southern region. Today, we'll be talking to anthropology professor Mark Rees about his Louisiana Public Archaeology Lab. Dr. Rees has dedicated his career to research, outreach, and education on Louisiana's endangered and undiscovered archaeological record and cultural resources. Hello and welcome to the Liberal Arts Showcase. I'm Dean Jordan Kelman, your host. We're here today with Dr. Mark Rees, Professor of Anthropology at UL Lafayette. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, good to be here.
So can you tell us a little bit about how you got interested in anthropology and uncovering Louisiana's deeply buried pasts?
Well, it probably goes back to my love of history, or my budding love of history as a child. I grew up mostly in Lafayette. My dad was in the Air Force, but when I moved here, I was very influenced by my grandparents. And my dad's parents had a large house in Brobridge, on the Bayou Teche, on the Teche Ridge. Sort of an older house filled with artifacts, literally, because my uncle is an anthropologist and had traveled. And so it just struck me that there was a history to the town of Brobridge. And my grandfather had done some genealogy and some history. And I think that played a role. I didn't think about that until years later, decades later. But it certainly played a role in my interest in history, historical archaeology from that, and then from that, archaeology in general.
And that's culminated now in a book that you've authored called Archaeology of Louisiana. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Right, that's a collaborative work. It was a major undertaking. We had not had an overview of Louisiana prehistory and historical archaeology for about 25 years. So the source material was a little dated, and I felt it was time to update that with a book that covers the archaeology of the state for a number of reasons, to make it available to a general readership, but also as a resource for professional archaeologists. And so thinking that it would be best served to have a group of specialists, I reached out, mostly members of the Louisiana Archaeological Society, the state chapter or state organization of archaeologists, and others as well, other professionals at universities and firms that do archaeology in the state. And we ended up having 26, I believe, authors of the different chapters. And so it's a really broad overview going back before 13,000 years ago.
Okay.
A number of chapters dealing on the historical archaeology of New Orleans, French colonial, Spanish colonial archaeology, but also spanning back to Paleo-Indian times, before the end of the last ice age. And I authored that chapter as well as another, so I was able to expand my interests as well. And it was fun, it was interesting, it was also a lot of work.
Okay.
But it's something that I think is going to need updating occasionally. Every few decades or so, we're going to have another book that addresses that and brings up to date.
But already it establishes lots of layers of Louisiana.
And it also identifies
the
gaps of what research needs to be done, I think, which is also, I think, a good product of a book like that.
Can you tell us a little bit about your public archaeology lab?
Well, the Louisiana Public Archaeology Lab I established in, I think, around 2014, which was right around the time when archaeology, really public archaeology in the state, was being hit hard, essentially being defunded. There were approximately five PhD holding archaeologists who had to leave the state, who were at universities as part of station archaeology programs and regional archaeology programs. This was part of the funding cuts to higher ed, but it was also a realignment of funding priorities in the state, at the state level. That really affected not just archaeology at the universities. I think it really had a negative impact. It also, I think, even more severely affected public archaeology, where individuals, landowners, people in the public would want to see some archaeology done, and who would they go to? Who would they reach out to? And so I thought a public archaeology lab that could respond to those interests and needs would be useful. And so that was sort of the impetus for developing it.
Okay. So you've been involved in many projects that are on the borderline between academic archaeology within the university and serving a public function or many public functions. One that comes to mind is the New Acadia project that you've been involved with for a while. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Right. The New Acadia project's really close to my heart. It actually started up around the same time as the Louisiana Public Archaeology Lab in 2014. And so there was really this is a perfect example of a public archaeology project, because I gave a talk at Vermilionville in Lafayette where I sort of lamented the fact that we did not know where the original home sites of the Acadians were, where these original home sites had been established in 1765 when the group of Acadians led by Joseph Beausoleil-Broussard had come to the Takapaw district, or to a place known as Foss Point.
So these are the famous ancestors of all Cajuns.
Well, maybe not all, but
okay.
Thousands, many, many thousands.
Okay.
There were other groups that came, but this was really the first large group to come to south central Louisiana. And some pretty famous individuals, Joseph Broussard, Beausoleil, and the heads of families that established their homes that really became the kernel, the seed of Acadiana. And so not only the home sites, which are named, these named home sites that were established, but also the burial places of approximately 32 individuals that died in the first few months, including Joseph Broussard, his brother, and others that were buried, because we have the records of their burials in 1765 near their home sites. And so the historical work, the bit of background that had been done, pointed to the area around Laurelville, okay, which is different than what most people think when they think of this. They think Evangeline, or they think St. Martinville proper, but that's not where the historical documents point to. The historical documents point to the south of St. Martinville along the Bayou Teche. So anyway, I gave my talk and I sort of lamented the fact that it's really a shame that we don't know these places. It's important for a number of reasons, not just for heritage. That's certainly a major part of it. We're all locally connected to the heritage of Acadiana, but the potential for economic development, the potential for historical knowledge and cultural knowledge. What were their lives like? What were they eating? What were they doing? What were their settlement patterns? How did they lay out their communities, their houses? We know some of that from the historical record, but there are amazing gaps. I mean, we really know much less than we should. And so the talk ended with a group coming to me and saying, we're behind you 100%. We're going to fundraise, we're going to support, and they formed a steering committee. And this is the New Acadia Project Steering Committee, which has been incredible, has supported us and provided us with the backing to purchase equipment that we need, to visit many of these sites. Essentially over about 4 years' time, working in the field in the summers and in about a month in the winter, we've been able to record over 36 archaeological sites, at least 12 of which have artifacts that date from the general period in question that we're interested in, that we're getting remarkably close, that we're producing evidence of colonial home sites in the Laurelville area. And it's sort of a detective work of building up a roster of suspects, or a roster of sites that we'd like to do more intensive work at.
How closely can we date such artifacts? How accurately?
Well, the artifacts, some are better than others. Some artifacts might give us a 100-year, 150-year or more time span. Others, much more narrow in terms of when they were manufactured. And so any single artifact alone by itself is not really that important. We have lots of artifacts from all these sites, thousands literally. It's the locational information. It's where the artifact came from.
Okay. Certain
ceramics, certain pieces of plates that would have been probably purchased in New Orleans, indicate that we're close or that we're possibly at the right kind of site. We call some of these tin enameled wares, or faience, for example, which were manufactured in the 1700s, but ceased to be manufactured in the 1770s or so. And so, you know, we're not going to make one artifact find that's going to be the breakthrough. It's going to be a number of artifact finds that date to the right time period that lead us to the remains, the archaeological remains of a dwelling, of a residence, possibly associated with a burial place nearby.
Okay. And we actually have some images here from this project. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what these show.
Sure. Well, these photos, the photo of the artifacts was taken in the field, so it's just on a paper bag as it was collected in the field before it was washed up. And there's really one astounding artifact here that we were all surprised and really excited to find, and that is the little piece of pipe right here, the little kaolin pipe stem.
Why was that so significant?
Well, it's always fun to find something like that. It's kind of rare to find it. It was a piece of a pipe stem from a smoking pipe made out of kaolin white clay that was really commonly used in the 1700s and early 1800s. And so, you know, we found probably 3 or 4 of those in the entire study area that we're looking at.
Okay.
And so it's one of the many artifacts that could, in fact, date to precisely the right time period. The other artifacts, the 2 other pieces of ceramic, are actually later. They're actually 2 pieces of whiteware with a sort of a bird foot or chicken foot pattern, and then some possible pearlware. I don't recall exactly, but the pearlware or a flow blue transfer printed ware may date from the 1770s to 1820 or so. So there are a lot of artifacts there that at this particular site that date to the present day, because there are a number of houses there today.
Right. And
so we might find artifacts that date from the 1970s or early 20th century. But curiously, we also find artifacts there that date from the mid 18th century, the mid 1700s. And that's sort of the red flag in the soil that would lead us to want to go back and open up a larger excavation. And this is really one of the more important sites that we have found, and this was just last summer, based on the land holding records and based on the artifacts from the site. We feel very strongly it's a good candidate for one of the potential locations of Nouvelle Acadie, or the original settlement of the Acadians.
That's very exciting. We're speaking with Mark Rees, Professor of Anthropology at UL Lafayette. Join us when we come back in a few minutes. Welcome back to the Liberal Arts Showcase. We're here with Dr. Mark Rees, Professor of Anthropology at UL Lafayette. Welcome back, Mark.
Thanks.
So you were telling us about some of these images that show the processes underway in the New Acadia project, the search for the living grounds and burial grounds of the original Acadian settlers to this area. Can you tell us about this second image?
Well, that may have been from a rainy day. That's just the field crew on the New Acadia project processing artifacts. In the field lab, so washing artifacts basically, laying them out to dry, and then they're rebagged, and then at a subsequent time, a student, in fact Regina, is going through and cataloging everything, identifying the specific type of artifact, the ceramic or whatever it is, associating it with its precise location, which again is the most important thing. In any one artifact, not as important as the location, weighing it, and going through and producing literally a catalog, a binder of all of the finds and their locations.
So there's a preliminary treatment of the specimens in the field, and then the rest of that analysis happens back in the lab.
Right.
And can you tell us about this image?
Well, that's a process that was repeated hundreds, if not 1,000 times, and that's the excavation and recording of a shovel test, which is a small sample of soil where the excavation is done. It's basically the diameter of a basketball, where we excavate a small amount of soil, really not that deeply, just going down into the subsoil, typically 2 feet, occasionally a little bit deeper, where we sift the soil, look for artifacts, or look for buried remains of a feature, a hearth or a foundation or something, and record the locations of the artifacts that come out of it. And literally, we've dug hundreds and hundreds of these across the Teche Ridge, looking for the new Acadia settlements. And very, very few of these have not produced artifacts. In fact, by one estimate, 80 to 90% of the excavation that we do produce artifacts.
And when you say artifacts, you mean dating back to the 18th century?
Not necessarily. Artifacts dating from the entire gamut, from recent times going back approximately 1,300 years. So we've found ceramics dating from about 700 AD at a number of sites, prehistoric Native American sites. And so it's a matter of identifying those ceramics that could date to the right time period that we're interested in. But we still need to document everything else in case in the future someone is interested in other occupations of the Teche Ridge.
But in terms of the burial sites that you were looking for, you've been able to start to narrow things down, and you feel that you're starting to zero in on the
I think so. We're in the laboratory processing phase, so we've got a lot of lab work to do in order to make sense of this, but we already can pretty much be confident that there are a number of sites, at least 3, that we'd like to go back to and do larger excavations to answer questions as to whether these might not be the settlement locations. We've also got locations of 2 abandoned family cemeteries that could contain earlier unmarked burials that could potentially lead us to the locations of the settlements. And as many as 4 or 5 locations that are purported to contain burials, but there are no headstones or markers. So these are family burial grounds. It's kind of amazing that the local knowledge of these locations. Most people don't have much information to present to us about the former locations of houses which have been moved or torn down or burned down. But people remember where there were graves, where there had been cemeteries, even if those headstones are no longer there. Literally, people have told us, 2 individuals were buried in a grove of oak trees on the Teche Ridge. So we know this location. There's nothing there today, but it's of interest to our project.
And you have means of doing some kind of reconnaissance of what's under the ground without bulldozing it all up?
Well, we wouldn't use bulldozers, but there is a lot of development in the region. And so housing, the residential neighborhoods, digging of ponds. And so there's a possibility that sites will be uncovered in sort of their usual development. That has actually happened. We do have remote sensing equipment. We have a device called a magnetometer, which works on principles that also detect metal. We need to get other techniques and perhaps professionals involved. We really need to gear up and get more support. We're actually in hopes of getting corporate sponsors through the Loreauville Family Fun Day and the Mayor Al 5K croc walk that the community of Loreauville has put on each year. And we've gotten corporate sponsorship. And we need this to field crews, to get crews out working for, say, 3 months in the summer, and to get equipment that we need. And also, I think now, to get a specialist in geophysical remote sensing, someone who can do not just a little bit of magnetometry, but someone who can do resistivity, ground penetrating radar, for example, and contrast these different techniques and try to figure out what's happening beneath the ground at some of these cemetery locations. We need that expertise as well. And so I'm in contact with some institutions that have that expertise, but we're hoping to get corporate backing and sponsorship and donations from the public to get the project going in the field again.
It's obviously a project of great significance to the public in this area. As we look at this next image, it looks to me like students processing the kind of shovel sample that you described digging up in the previous image in some kind of sieve device, but
Right.
I understand that this is actually from a different project.
Right, so this is in Lafayette. In fact, it's at the Ile Copal site, which is right off of Pinhook. And it's well known by many people because there's actually a sign. There's a historical marker there that this was the home of Governor Alexandre Mouton, the first Democratic governor of the state of Louisiana. He was governor before the Civil War, a well-known individual, in fact, a member of the Mouton family, the son of Jean Mouton, who's credited as the founder of Lafayette, who donated the land. In fact, Governor Mouton's residence had been located here. We know from historical maps that it burned down either at the end of 1927 or 1928. So we have a good idea of where that residence was located. We had a class, and so Robin and Kelsey are shown here as part of this class. We went out for a couple of weekends, and we looked for evidence of the residence, the Mouton residence, as well as hoping to find evidence of other activities at this site. There was a public school. In fact, the first African-American public school, post-Reconstruction school, was established here with Principal Paul Breaux. And that was 1927, in fact. And in fact, we found evidence of that as well. But there's also a complex, a plantation complex there, a sugar house. There were approximately 120 enslaved individuals, families that were living in slave quarters, which there would be evidence of beneath the ground. There was a church, there was a cemetery, the houses of the slaves. And it's most certainly there's going to be some archaeological remains associated with all of that. And so there's a great potential for education about community history and preserving some of that evidence that we really don't know much about the people who lived there and produced a lot of the wealth of the sugar plantation.
You mentioned that this was the largest plantation in the area
at the time. That's right, that's correct. And in fact, the sugar mill or the sugar house was the largest, and it processed cane from a number of outlying plantations. The sugar house was burned during the Civil War. It became a Union Army encampment. So it's got an association with Civil War history as well. It's really an integral part of Lafayette's history.
Is that part of the reason it's not more preserved? That one would think that with being so important at the time that there would still be gravestones or...
Well, actually, that's not unusual. The quarters associated with the slaves and with the cemetery, I'm not surprised that none of that remains. That's normally sort of erased or taken off of the landscape. It's the main residence or the main house that burned, which is a bit, disappointing because we would have had that original location and we could, by association, place the sugar house a little bit better. But it's not unusual that we have an absence of these buildings, but just because the buildings are gone does not mean that there's not information on this history buried just beneath the ground.
Right.
And we confirmed just in 2 weekends that there are in fact artifacts and buried intact cultural features associated with Ile Copal. We've actually had support on this with the Lafayette Science Museum. We were excavating with the assistance of Lafayette Parish School System. The Acadiana Planning Commission is interested in having this project move forward, and also the Bayou Vermilion District, because it's right on the Vermilion, close to the Vermilion Bayou. The house was situated on the bayou, looking towards the bayou. And so there's a lot of community interest in this, and I think if we can show some results by going back possibly the end of this semester or the early summer, just going back for a few weekends, I think we could get a lot of people interested in Lafayette's history.
These are clearly fascinating projects and extremely important to the public in a variety of ways, and we're really glad that you are pursuing them, because nobody was pursuing these projects until you started them, Dr. Rees. We'd love to hear more about your many other projects that you have underway and in development, but we're out of time, so we'll have to have you back for another interview where we'll hear all about those. We have been talking today with Dr. Mark Rees, Professor of Anthropology at UL Lafayette. Thank you very much, Dr. Rees.
Sure, it was a pleasure.
Join us next time.